As some of you know, I was not with you last week because I had the honor of preaching the ordination sermon of the Reverend J. Sylvan at the Bay Area Unitarian Universalist Church down by NASA. Ordinations are special affairs. They typically mark the culmination of years' worth of work on the part of the new minister, and the moment in which a congregation elects someone into our ministry. In our tradition, it is the congregation and the congregation alone that has the power to ordain someone. The Fellowship Committee of the Unitarian Universalist Association only recommends someone for ordination. The actual act, the actual ability to make an individual a minister, rests with the congregational meeting. It is the membership gathered in such a meeting that has the power to call ministers, elect officers, adopt statements of covenant, and determine the direction of the community. The long history of our movement in North America, uplifting the democratic power of our assemblies, has been one of the most enduring of our practices. There is something moving between us which we cannot tame and cannot measure. The purpose of the church is to get a hold of people like me and change them. These two quotes offer different expressions of the power that can be present in our assemblies. They express aspects of what we Unitarian Universalists call our living tradition. We do not take our theology as fixed. To be a Unitarian Universalist and to be a Unitarian Universalist congregation is to be constantly reworking and reimagining our understandings of what it means to be a religious, and even to be human. We have a great deal of theological diversity amongst us, but we have settled on a few things. As James Luther Adams pointed out some years ago, we agree that both life and salvation, however we want to understand it, take place in community and in time. The sense of nowhere else but here is tied to our belief that revelation is not sealed. New knowledge, new forms of creativity, new kinds of experience, new ways of being are always emerging. Scientific discoveries challenge and expand our knowledge of life, the universe, and everything. We believe, Ethelred Brown wrote, that religion and science are not contradictory, but complementary. It is not a coincidence that Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin, amongst other scientific thinkers, have connections to our faith. Nor is it a coincidence that many Unitarian Universalist theologians look to recent scientific findings as a resource for their work. I mention all of this on a Sunday when we are holding a congregational meeting. I want to offer you a gentle reminder that to be part of a congregation is to be open to change. And following this service, those of you who have been members of First Unitarian Universalist for 60 days or more will be voting on two items. First, we'll consider approving the proposed vision, mission, and covenant. And second, we'll be deciding whether or not to accept the new bylaws. Each of the documents that the membership will contemplate is the result of months of work of dedicated lay leaders. Through intentional engagement, numerous conversations, and not a little debate, committees of the board have worked carefully to craft a set of statements that represent two dimensions of the congregation's aspiration. One to determine the community's purpose, the other to articulate its practice of self-governance. There is something moving between us which we cannot tame and cannot measure. The purpose of the church is to get a hold of people like me and change them. The spirit of this congregation is greater than something that can be put into words. It's found in the acts of kindness, the practice of worship, the devotion to inquiry, the insistence on justice that we share together. It is expressed in our commitment to build the beloved community, a world in which the human family is whole and reconciled, and we live in ever greater harmony with the earth. Building the beloved community requires individual change, individual transformation. James Luther Adams' story is a favorite example of this. In it, the antagonist finally recognizes that to be part of a congregation is to accept the possibility that life together will alter us for the better. Though that reshaping will not always be easy or comfortable. Indeed, the company of that something between us that we cannot tame and cannot measure can sometimes even be a bit overwhelming. Last time I was with you, I spoke with you about one of the moments in the history of this congregation that changed how the then membership understood what it means to build beloved community. Shared with you something of the story around the congregation's 1954 decision to desegregate. And I described how, after that decision, about 10% of the membership resigned. They were afraid of change, of personal transformation. They did not want to be part of a community that included getting a hold of people like them and pushing them to live out their values, rather than merely talk about them. Instead of the discomfort of a living tradition, in which what it means to be Unitarian Universalist shifts from generation to generation, they wanted the comfort of fixity. But a Unitarian Universalist congregation, like Unitarian Universalism, is anything but fixed. The vote on the proposals this afternoon is a reaffirmation of our living tradition. It's an expression that the members of First Unitarian Universalist are the ones who control the congregation's fate and corporate identity. And it is an acknowledgement about the nature of this community and that nature alters across time. In the lead up to such a vote, it's worth reviewing the living tradition of this particular congregation. It is unique, though it follows many of the patterns within our larger association. I shared with you a couple of weeks ago that the initial impetus to organize this congregation came from the Universalist circuit rider Colin. He started coming to Houston at the end of the 19th century, but it was not until February of 1914 that the First Unitarian Church of Houston was gathered. At its first congregational meeting, the members, and there were 8 of them then, elected their leadership. At its second one, those 8 people passed a resolution to describe the purpose as devoted to the promotion of high ideals of a reasonable, reverent, and helpful religion, and adopted a covenant that explicitly linked the new community to liberal Christianity. The Reverend Arthur Wynne was one of the ministers from that early era. Described by congregational historian Alice Cowles as a white-haired, ethereal-looking man, he preached sermons in which he encouraged the members to take Jesus as a moral exemplar. He exhorted them with statements like, "We would do well to think of Jesus as he was, the champion of freedom, the teacher who did not look back to scribe or prophet, and the leader of those who would rise to the highest possibilities of the Spirit within each." The minister who followed Wynne was the Reverend John Petrie. He began his work here in the autumn of 1938. Prior to him, all of the ministers had had short tenures, some staying in Houston only for a few months, others for a couple of years. Unlike them, Petrie stayed for more than a decade. Alice Cowles reminds him of very hard of hearing and observes that his wife Ethel accompanied him almost everywhere, performing the pastoral care primarily herself and distributing gifts of fruit and flowers from her yards. It was under Petrie's ministry that First Unitarian Universalist really began to develop its own particular living tradition, though not necessarily in ways that he approved. He was one of the most politically and theologically conservative Unitarian ministers of his generation. He began his religious service as an aspirant for the Catholic priesthood, converted to Episcopalianism, and arrived in Texas as the kind of Unitarian who proclaimed the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of Jesus, or the brotherhood of man, and the leadership of Jesus. These were the years when humanism was growing in dynamism and popularity amongst our congregations. Petrie did not approve. He published statements that almost read like creeds in First Unitarian Universalist's newsletters, affirming his commitment to Christianity. He attacked the atheistic philosophy calling itself humanism as the worst enemy of man, and decried those who preached it from the pulpit. Even went so far to publicly call other Unitarian ministers, including the leadership of much of the board of directors of the American Unitarian Association, as communists. And then he began to urge the congregation to leave the American Unitarian Association, one of the precursors to our present Unitarian Universalist Association. He actually managed to go so far as to successfully convince the congregation to disaffiliate with the Southwest Unitarian Conference. And then he managed to persuade the members at a congregational meeting to affiliate with the Texas Conference of Congregational Churches. For the rest of his ministry, First Unitarian Universalist took the name the First Unitarian Congregationalist Church. His signature achievement was starting to raise the money to build this sanctuary. The congregation had been meeting on this property since the early 1930s. During his ministry, the congregation held a meeting and decided to stay on this lot rather than move out to the then suburbs. Though it was not recognized as such at the time, the vote marked the beginning of the membership's commitment to be a Center City congregation. Though the membership grew tired of Petrie's tirades by 1949, they did not do so before the design of this space began. And I've seen no direct evidence of this in the archives, but I suspect that it was due to his influence that a subtle cross was installed in the big Fannin-facing windows. Following Petrie's departure, the congregation met to call the Reverend Horace Westwood as the minister. Westwood was far less doctrinaire than Petrie. His father was a noted Unitarian minister, and he was the first clergy person to serve the congregation who was devoted to theological and religious pluralism. Shortly after he arrived, he began a practice of pulpit exchanges with the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel, and preached sermons in which he affirmed unity and diversity. He spoke respectfully of humanism from the pulpit, though he claimed to be some kind of theist. This quickly proved to be too much to the members who had found Petrie to be inspirational. They decided to leave en masse and form what is now the First Congregational Church of Houston. Interestingly, this congregation decided to support them in their effort to form a liberal Christian church. Our newsletters at the time have encouraging articles about their efforts. And it is notable that their present mission is quite similar to the congregation's covenant from 1914. and that their minister for many years, the Reverend Bob Tucker, used to meet with the Houston Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, and that when he retired from active ministry, he joined this congregation. A few years after the congregation aided in the establishment of the First Congregational Church, it formed another Unitarian church. Emerson was initially served by Horace Westwood for a year before they called their own minister. The story, and I suspect it is a legend, is that he would finish preaching his sermon here and then get on his bike and ride over to Bering Drive, past what is now the Galleria area, to preach the sermon again. By the time the Westwood era ended, there are certain key characteristics of this congregation's living tradition had been established. These included a commitment to being a center city congregation, a centering of the struggle for justice within community life, dedication to supporting other Unitarian Universalist congregations, and a commitment to religious pluralism. Westwood left in 1972. He was followed by the Reverend Webster Kitchell, who uplifted his interpretation of indigenous spirituality as part of an expansion of the community's sense of pluralism. His ministry also saw the congregation support the formation of yet another church, this time lending encouragement, aid, and an initial meeting space to the Metropolitan Community Church, a Christian community devoted to serving the LGBTQ community. Kitchell was here for a decade. The minister after him was the Reverend Bob Shibley. Some of you knew him, and I spoke about his ministry several weeks ago during my sermon on the proposed covenant. It included path-breaking work with the LGBTQ community and important advocacy for the city's immigrants. What I did not share at the time, and which longer-term members will recall, was Bob's relationship with Buddhism. It's because of him that we have a Zen garden out of those windows in our courtyard. And it was because of him that the congregation was once again able to expand its commitment to religious pluralism. He studied with Thich Nhat Hanh, and while serving as your minister, was one of the founders of the Houston Zen Center. There is something moving between us that we cannot tame and cannot measure: the living tradition of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston. When we hold our congregational meeting this afternoon, we will be affirming that we are a living tradition. We will be honoring this congregation's evolution from liberal Christianity to religious pluralism. And we will be stating the nature of our living tradition today. I hope that we will do so by adopting a covenant, a statement about what it means to be a member of this community. I hope so that we will do so by voting to approve a vision, a statement about our aspirations in the world, and a mission, how we hope to live out those aspirations. Let me address the last point, the mission, before I close. I've not focused on it throughout this sermon for a single reason. I suggest that a review of the congregation's history reveals that it is not a new mission. Instead, it is a mission that you, the congregation, and your religious forebears have come to over the course of a more than 100-year history. If you adopt the mission, you will be affirming what is already the living tradition of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston. You'll be recognizing that you have strived to build the beloved community in the past and recommitting to do so in the future. There is something moving between us that we cannot tame and cannot measure. The purpose of the church is to get a hold of people like me and change them. In reverence for the living tradition that is Unitarian Universalism, and with respect for that which is greater than all but resides within each, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.